reform the police, defund the police, disband the police. Since the Memorial Day death of George Floyd in Minneapolis, you've begun to hear these demands more and more, both on the news and in the streets. But what do these demands really mean? And if any or all of them are met, how will it impact you and your community? Hi, I'm Christopher Norris, the community contributors and engagement editor at WHYY. For the past few weeks, we've been exploring the future of public safety in our region. In this final episode, we'll turn to our elected leaders to weigh in on this conversation. Here's what they had to say. This is Police Reimagined.
Councilmember, Professor, thank you guys for joining with me. I'm going to start with you, Councilmember. You voted yes for the 2021 fiscal year budget, which did not defund the police. Only Councilmember Kendra Brooks, an independent, was one of 3 no votes. And she said no because she was uncomfortable with the rate that we're funding the police department. So why are you comfortable with the rate that we're funding it, which is 15% of the city's operating budget?
So thank you for having me, and thank you for that important question. I'm actually not comfortable with the way that we decided to reduce the budget of the police, but at the same time, there were a lot of things that I did fight for in that budget that I did ask for that actually were met. And politics is unfortunately a place that requires more negotiating than what you actually want to. And when 95% of the requests that we put in were actually made, we had to concede that 5% because we recognized that we had to assure that other departments and organizations and city employees had what they need to essentially move forward. I think the biggest thing for me was that there were no tax increase for the average everyday citizen while facing a $750 million deficit while operating in the middle of a pandemic.
What were some of the things you fought for in this budget that the public may not know about?
Oh, so for me, first and foremost, was the Public Defender's Office. And I continue to have a working relationship with the great work that's being done there. When you anticipate the overflow that we will have in our courts, not only fighting for them, but the District Attorney's Office as well, too. So those are 2 things at the top of my list, as well as support for the workers in the prisons who unfortunately did not receive any hazardous pay. To make sure that we made space for them in the budget. My personal thing is City Year. That mattered a lot to me. I wanted to make sure that program was restored, as well as AmeriCorps. We wanted to make sure that they were funding for the arts, as well as the African American History Museum. And I know some of my freshman colleagues would be upset with me if I didn't talk about the great work that they did, assuring that we had that money, that $20 million in the housing fund. So all those things are important to me.
I'm sorry, yeah, Professor, I'm going to go to you in a second, but Councilman, I just want to follow up. In LA, it appears they're moving forward with defunding the police by $100 million and plans to invest that money into the Black community. Some of the people I've talked to so far say that the city officials missed the moment here to show political courage and do something different. What would you say to those constituents who are disappointed?
Well, I would say that the moment has just started. I think that for a lot of us, we were advocating for a reduction in the police budget and reallocation of dollars as soon as the pandemic hit. And that was not a starter conversation at all. So for us to be able to get put in a position where not only did we not see a reduction, we did see some money reallocated to a different space. I think for us, that essentially is a victory because it was a conversation that we started before this all happened, the unfortunate situation with George Floyd. And because of the movement of the people and because of the demands of the people, we've seen some progress. So for me, this is not the end. For me, we did not miss the moment. For me, the moment has just started. For me, it's just the beginning. And it puts us in a position where we can have robust dialogues like we're having today to reimagine what policing will look like moving forward. And I look forward to having that conversation because I know I have some ideas around directions we can move in now that we begin to have a serious conversation around policing in Philadelphia.
Thank you, Councilman. Professor, I'm going to ask you a very specific question, but I also want to give you the chance just to follow up and respond or react to the budget vote and anything that you've heard the councilman say.
Certainly, and I absolutely appreciate the situation that the council person is in, and I absolutely agree that we're talking about just the beginning of what will be an extended moment of political struggle, mobilization, and pressure. However, of course, I think this is the moment to, it's June 2020, right? This is the moment to think big, to push for, for more radical goals before this energy dissipates. We've got people, of course, in the streets nationwide talking about and effectively pressuring cities to entirely dismantle police in Minneapolis. We've got school districts like Oakland just yesterday voting to eliminate their school police. We've got a whole range of options that are being developed. And I think now is the time to think big. And I encourage everyone to begin to think about the role that police play in this over-policed society, this over-incarcerated society. And one of the main tasks is actually to begin to think differently, because when you're holding a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And we look at every problem from homelessness to drug use to psychological and mental problems as police problems. And we try to solve them through the police. And this is simply not the way that's going to move us forward.
I had a question for you, Professor, but I want to touch back on that, and I want to go to the councilman on that. One of the problems that we've been having, and I've been talking with councilmen, is that people don't understand what they're getting back as the return on investment. They've invested $120 million in taxpayers, an increase over the last 5 years. Yet violence, the homicide rate is up over the last 5 years. Our national homicide clearance rate is below the national average. We're still racial disparities in stop and frisk and marijuana arrests. What is the public getting for all this money that's being spent?
I think that's a great question. And when you add into that the settlements that cities pay on behalf of police departments, the settlement that the city is very likely going to pay with regard to the gassing of protesters on 676, this is even more money that doesn't need to be spent, and that is coming back to the citizens for very, as you put it, very well, very little return. And it seems confusing until you understand what I would argue, which is that the police are not really there to make cities safer. They're not there to deal with actual problems, to lower violence. They're there to control populations, and they're there to uphold the desires and the demands of the wealthy. And once we begin to look at a machine and understand that the machine is not broken, the machine was never built to perform the function that we think that it does. The massive increase in police funding nationwide, the militarization of the police, did not correspond to an increase in crime. It wasn't a response to an increase in crime. It was a response to a perception that the police were the only way to solve problems, and that mass incarceration was the only way to warehouse those problem individuals. And I think we're starting to realize, thankfully, that this is not the only solution, and we're beginning to think more creatively.
Councilman, what would you say to the constituents who are unclear what the return on investment is on all this money that we're putting into the police department? They don't feel safe.
Yeah, I would tell the constituents that you're literally asking the same questions that I did in the midst of our budget hearing when we talked to the police commission. I was seriously, and I know we're talking about police reform, and again, I have a number of ideas around that, but I was seriously concerned as it relates to the fact that when I was first sworn in, I was told that the majority of the homicides that we've seen in the city of Philadelphia were essentially solved by technology. And so it baffled my mind that the murder rate increased during the pandemic when everybody was home, and technology wasn't essentially used to address those issues. If there's less people home, well, how come we didn't see an improvement in the arrest rate as opposed to homicides in the city of Philadelphia? We actually seen our numbers drop significantly, and we were told it was because everybody was home. So it was this contradicting message that's been presented to me over my first 6 months as it relates to my term in city council. And to be honest with you, and the listening audience, I'm not quite sure that I can give them a quality answer. And I think what we have to recognize is that doesn't mean that all police officers are bad. That's not what we're saying. We're saying that we have a system and an institution that's supposed to function in a certain capacity, and it doesn't work. And I agree with the professor 100%. The system in the current system is the infrastructure is to design the wealthy, but we can't forget the privileged as well too. So while we do have a number of white allies who do agree with the fact that we do need to see police reform, we have to also recognize that it took a number of different catastrophes for us to get to this point. And we also have to recognize that those same allies do have the advantages that they essentially advocate against. So that's an important conversation that we essentially have to have. And we have to make sure that we remain focused on the issue as it relates specifically to people of color and the interactions that we have with police, whether we choose to or not.
I appreciate your honesty, Councilman. Professor, in the synopsis of your forthcoming book, A World Without Police, you write, quote, "So unquestioned and unquestionable is the role of police in our society that few are even willing to consider the alternatives." What are the alternatives, and why are you willing to consider them?
Well, it's funny to hear you read back those words and then to realize that we're in a moment where suddenly that sentence is not true anymore. Suddenly people are considering alternatives. And I think that's an amazing moment that we're living in. I've been working on this book for a couple of years now, and these questions were never posed in public in the way that they're being posed today. So the first thing to say, I think, is that that's amazing. The second thing is that the alternatives, that we talk about in the book, whether they're international, whether they're in the United States, and whether they're those alternatives that we're seeing emerge and we will see emerge over the next few months and couple of years, are going to be a work in progress, and they're going to be grounded in the idea that that we can build communities that don't require the police to function the way that they do.
To the councilman, what are the alternatives to policing? Are you, as the city leader, willing to consider them?
So I am 100%. And so what I think about first and foremost is who are in our schools and who assure safety in our schools. That's one place that we can start right there. We also can look at something that we've done in the city of Philadelphia is who's in charge of traffic stops and traffic issues moving forward, and dealing specifically when there's, issues of that capacity. We can also continue to explore who responds to 911 calls and how that looks. And so for me, I'm 100% open to looking at who responds to 911 calls, how our neighborhoods are policed, what policing needs to look like. And I'm open to a robust conversation. I'm proud to be a part of the police reform work group, where we specifically talk about what police change can look like from a legislative perspective. And that's made up of a collective of young African-American elected officials across the state of Pennsylvania, as well as Kira Bradford Gray, who I call the mother of the criminal justice reform we're seeing here in the city of Philadelphia. And so the goal is for us as legislators to have as many robust ideas as possible to put us in a position where we can have legislation that allows us to essentially exercise and brainstorm these different ideas and then essentially turn ideas into implementation.
I appreciate that. Isaiah, Councilman, excuse me, I'm going to stick with you. 30 seconds on this answer and then 30 seconds for you, Professor. What does it mean to live in a safe community? Safety, what does that mean?
So for me, safety means waking up every day and being able to move about my business and go where I want to go and not have to worry about the conditions that other people in other communities and other neighborhoods essentially have to worry about. Safety comes in many forms, and you see in various Black African-American communities, not just in Philadelphia, but all across the country, they are not put in a position where their level of safety is the same as their white counterparts.
Professor, what does it mean to live in a safe community?
I think no one wants, for example, armed gangs wandering the streets when you don't know how they're going to act, if they're going to involve you in some violence or involve or harm someone in your family, whether it's what we call gangs normally or whether it's the police, who often rain down violence upon many communities in a greater degree than they actually solve crimes and prevent violence. And I think we need to begin to think about what it would take to make communities that look like that would make police obsolete instead.
Councilman, Professor, thank you so much for your time. We're going to continue this conversation right now with District Attorney Larry Krasner. District Attorney Krasner, thanks for joining this important conversation. We're reimagining police, thinking about the future of public safety. So my first question to you is, how would you reimagine our police department? What should we be doing and thinking differently in this moment?
Great to be here talking with you, Mr. Norris. Well, boy, where do I begin? So I think probably the very first thing we all need to do is lose our stereotypes, including our stereotypes about police. That is, we all fall prey to them, and it can really distract you from the task at hand. The reality is, and I say this very sincerely, there's a lot of great cops, there really are. What we are dealing with above all else is a culture that has to be broken. And I mean, its spine has to be broken. We're going to do anything. There is a tremendous vacuum of accountability coming from many different directions. The laws that govern police when they arguably run afoul of the criminal statutes, all kinds of disciplinary things. There's a politics that runs counter to any kind of real reform that has a lot to do with the weirdly almost unique posture that police unions can find themselves in, where the leadership has divorced itself from the wishes of the public and even the wishes of the active police officers. There are many, many layers to this. I've had the blessing or misfortune of having my nose in it for a long time. So I think the best I can say is, how do we get there? Well, that's a long talk and we'll do it. But what would it look like when we're done? What it looks like when we're done is policing that is by peace officers as opposed to militarized police. What it looks like is fewer officers and fewer dollars, and more of that money invested in prevention so that we don't need so many officers, so many dollars. It looks like some more specialized units that are able to take away from policing a lot of things that really should not be in their bailiwick, such as dealing with mental illness, dealing with addiction, dealing with homelessness, things of that sort. It would look very, very different.
That piece right there, talking about allocating not just money to different departments, but allocating these responsibilities. I think where protesters and police are finding consensus right now, even if they're not admitting it, is that everyone thinks the police are doing too much. They're overworked, they're overwhelmed. Do you think that's part of why we see some of the, I'll say, failures in terms of our homicide clearance rate being below the national average, our marijuana arrests and pedestrian stops, not seeing any real true mitigation in the racial disparities, just the crime rate in general? Are some of the things that we're not seeing done by the police department, is that a result of the fact that they're doing too much other stuff?
Yes. You know, one of the ironies of progressive approaches to prosecution is that most of us who've been elected around the country really believe that policing has lost its focus. Its focus should be on truly violent, very serious crimes. It should be on the individuals who are driving, violent crime. And instead, what it became in Ferguson and many other places, to some degree, almost everywhere, was this ever-growing institution that arrested more and more people for more and more minor things, as a means of social control, as an industry, as a form of political capital, as a patronage pit. It became all of these other things. And it needs to go back to being what it was, which is peace officers whose focus is really not on trying to address every social ill that we have defunded. It needs to be defunded, by which I mean it's funding reduced. I'm not talking about eliminated, but it needs to be defunded in favor of things that work better. How can we expect police to go into a situation where they're dealing with a chronic schizophrenic and they have really no training in how to do that? How can we expect them to do that better than someone with a psychology degree? You know, I mean, it just doesn't make sense. Why would we want to do that? Is it a surprise then that we see in many of those situations where you have even a naked schizophrenic man who is holding a screwdriver in his hand pointed basically at the ground, they shoot him to death, okay? I mean, how is that a surprise? When you teach people one thing and ask them to do something completely different, there are gonna be bad consequences for everyone, you know, and then there's the lawsuit and the $10 million later, because what happened was the wrong thing, or you could have had people with expertise in the field who were not coming to this dressed up as Ninja Turtles to go in and deal with that kind of situation.
How did we get here? Is it the tough on crime philosophy that allowed us to rely almost exclusively on police for public safety?
How do we get here as a culture? My goodness. Oh my goodness. We go way back. I'll leave the entire discussion of the morphing of slavery into police. I'll leave that to people more knowledgeable in it than myself. But it certainly is the case during my lifetime, and I'm now almost 60, certainly is the case during my lifetime that tough on crime, essentially as pushed by Richard Nixon, who, by the way, was a criminal, but let's not get into all that whole level of hypocrisy and irony. Tough on crime has been good politics for a very long time. It has been a dog whistle about race for a very long time. And the position of district attorney has become, exactly during the period of time when we have seen this rise of mass incarceration, it has become a vital part of the resume for a lot of people hoping to become U.S. senators or members of the House of Representatives or President of the United States. So what we have had is a very politicized prosecution, and we have had a very politicized prosecution that was pandering to police, because that was how, if you were Arlen Specter, you could become a U.S. senator. And by the way, he was the DA in Philadelphia at 35 years of age. That was how, if you were Ed Rendell, you could become the mayor, then you could become the governor, then you could become, very close friend with Bill Clinton, who is still a prevalent voice in the Democratic Party as a moderate, even at this point in his life. That man was 33 years old when he became DA in Philadelphia County. And neither one of those men got very far from the leadership, I stress leadership, of the Fraternal Order of Police, which in many ways sits in a very, very different, very, very throwback, very conservative, very Republican, exclusively white, And based on some of their affiliations, associations, the things you say, unfortunately, arguably at times, racist.
Are they a barrier to reform? Are they a barrier to justice?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Now, let me be clear. I'm not speaking of the rank and file. I'm not speaking of the membership. Every single person who is in the police department and all of its retirees are FOP. And there's a lot of great ones in there, especially, the ones who have come up in the last 25, 30 years. But you have to understand who runs the FOP. The FOP is run by its retired membership because they vote, because they continue to pay some form of dues, because the total dues that are coming from the retired membership is greater than the dues of the active membership. So what you have in reality in the FOP in Philadelphia, which is a very powerful one because it's a single FOP for the entire city, which is not how it works everywhere. And it's also, the fourth largest police force in the sixth, soon seventh largest city. So you have an outsized police force. What you have is Archie Bunker in Bucks County. And I realize that's an old man reference, right? And I'm an old man. But what you have is very, very conservative white ethnic control over an organization. It's coming from a bunch of armchair quarterbacks who are retired, who came up in one way or another in the shadow of Frank Rizzo and the brutality and racism he stood for. Those people are running that union, and they are running it into the ground to the detriment of the rank and file of an increasingly diverse active membership of the police department.
Let me ask you about that brutality. I've had several people that wanted me to ask you this question, and let me set the stage for you. Right after the looting on 52nd Street, I watched a video from Councilman Curtis Jones. There was a guy who was speaking to Police Commissioner Danielle Outlaw, and he was saying how he felt city officials were encouraging him and their neighbors to stand in between the looters, to stop the looting, to protect the neighborhood, to interrupt that misconduct. And he said, I don't care about the TV. I want to be able to interrupt the misconduct that's happening by police on our streets. So when we talk about public safety, to a lot of people, that also means protecting themselves and their families from police brutality. From a legal standpoint, do people have, so for example, they saw a cop with a knee on someone's neck in the neighborhood. Do they have any legal duty to intervene?
You're asking whether civilians have a legal duty to intervene?
What they have a legal duty, or can they intervene and not face prosecution? What's the standard? If someone is sitting in a neighborhood, they're watching police brutality, can they do anything, or do they just have to hope to file a complaint later?
I am proud to say I think our DA's office tries to be pretty fair to everybody, and that means to a civilian trying to save the life of a person who is in the position of George Floyd, I would like to think that we would be very fair to someone who did that.
What does that mean?
Well, I mean, let's talk about what it really means. Just imagine the George Floyd video. If someone had jumped in there and tried to stop that officer from doing what he did, it's hard to know whether there'd be one dead person or more.
Very true.
Let's not kid ourselves. What you're dealing with in that individual and that situation, and in a culture that basically says, if you ever interfere with what I am doing as a police officer in the line of duty, then I must dominate that situation. It could indeed be very dangerous, but let's just say that there is a good Samaritan who just can't take it, just cannot watch this man die, and who jumps in there. What that would mean with any decent prosecutor who analyzed the situation is that that person, even if that person had to use force to get the officer off of George Floyd, was justified. The law in Pennsylvania is like the law in many other places. Everybody says self-defense. It's actually justification. And it means that you can defend yourself, even if you have to use force and violence at times, but you can also defend another person who's being attacked, let's say, by domestic violence, a domestically violent partner. Yes, you can get in the middle and punch that guy in the face when he's trying to strangle his, his girlfriend or whomever on the street. I mean, sometimes the law runs a little bit sideways, but this is why it matters that you have district attorneys who have some sense. Because if they actually are going to be fair, they are not going to want George Floyd to die. They're not going to want to punish a person who at minute 8 says, I can't take this anymore, and goes to push the officer off of him. I can tell you that in Philadelphia, we would have no problem with that situation. I would just hope nobody gets killed in the process.
I appreciate that response. I got about 60 seconds left. I'm going to ask you this, and then I'll wrap it up. Speaking of fairness, the police commissioner recently apologized for tear gassing peaceful protesters on 676. To some, that was considered an act of police misconduct by then Deputy Police Commissioner Dennis Wilson. Yes or no, are there any plans at your office to charge the Deputy Commissioner who gave the approval to use the CS gas?
I would love to answer your question. I cannot answer your question because I cannot disclose whether or not there is a pending investigation, but I can tell you this because it's already been reported in the press. Number one, police commissioner was not there when the incident occurred. Number two, Dennis Wilson has stated that he's the one who gave the order. So I'm not giving away any secrets there. Number three, the officer responsible for pulling down masks of seated and kneeling people so that he could take a giant can of OC spray or mace and spray them directly in their eyes and their mouth. That officer has been suspended for 30 days with the intent to dismiss. I believe that that is Officer Nicoletti. If I'm incorrect, I apologize, but I believe that that is Officer Nicoletti, not the older one who was depicted shooting to death someone in a car, a case that was investigated by Mr. Shapiro's office where they brought no charges, but the younger one. So while there are wheels in motion, just as with the Pownall case, I can't always talk about wheels in the middle of it.
And when you say Pownall case, you're referring to Ryan Pownall, the police officer charged with third-degree murder in the case of David Jones.
Who is currently charged with that case and it is awaiting trial at some point when we start doing trials again. It's awaiting trial. So, but the commissioner has also revealed that she sent us a package. She sent us the internal affairs investigation for our consideration. The significance of that, so I'm not giving away secrets. The significance of that is that sometimes the police department sends a file for our consideration about whether or not we want to bring charges. Sometimes they don't. For example, Carl Holmes, who is now charged with sexually assaulting 3 different women police officers. He himself was a police inspector at the time of his arrest and had been a high-ranking police official for a long time. That is a case where even though there were internal affairs investigations of his alleged sexual impropriety is probably too gentle a word, even though there were those investigations, internal affairs never sent it to the DA's office for the consideration. Please also understand the DA's office does not have to have anything referred to them. We can go investigate whenever we have the opportunity, whatever we want. But my point is that when the police department says, here, DA, you may want to look at this, and it has to do with the use of tear gas or the use of OC spray down on 676, that is an institutional recognition that there might be something wrong here that might rise to the level of criminal conduct.
I appreciate your candor, your honesty. In 30 seconds, Mr. Krasner, what does it take to build a safe community? What does that mean to you, to live in a community that's safe? What does it look like?
I think the community that we all want to see would be one that is more unified. It would be one where the division between police and the people they serve is somewhat reconciled. It would be a form of policing that is less like a military occupation and is more built on a model of interaction, community activity. It would be a less racist kind of an interaction. And frankly, it would be smaller. We would be using a lot of those resources in ways that are smarter, but we would also be reducing the amount of resources that are going into something that, if we look at the prevalence of guns on the street, which is greater than ever, the prevalence of drugs on the street, which is greater than ever, would be going a different direction because we know the direction we are going has failed. There's just no question that more and more and more police has not reduced the guns, it has not reduced the violence, it has not reduced the quantity of drugs on the street. Those tactics have failed. We need to go in the direction of prevention.
Mr. District Attorney, thank you so much for your time. Your contributions were invaluable. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Norris. Always a pleasure.
This has been an enlightening 4 weeks, but one thing is for sure, we're just getting started, and WHRY is committed to facilitating these critical conversations around the region. For WHRY, I'm Chris Norris. Good night.